I want to talk to you about 3 big misconceptions around the Bible. And I suppose it's only fair to start off by telling you the ones that I'm going to address, because I'm sure that in some people's minds there's more than 3. But the 3 I'm going for are these because I hear them so often. The first one is it's boring. So I want to talk about that because that is a misconception. It's a boring book. The second one is that it's a difficult book. And people say that a lot. It's a very difficult book. Or they choose one, particular book in the library of the Bible and say, that's a really difficult book. Then the other one is that it's dead. It's a dead book because, well, it's been around a long time and everyone who's written it is dead. So it must be a dead book. So let's take each one of those. Let's talk about boring, first of all. Now, most people who say it's boring must never have read it. That's all I can assume. Because actually, one filmmaker who wanted to write the story of Jesus called it the greatest story ever told. And people who love stories just, I don't know how they could possibly find the Bible boring, because, any soap opera would be blessed with stories like this. And in fact, I think a lot of soap operas do take their stories from this, because when you're reading it, there's nothing hidden. This is like all human life is there. But what is incredible, in the midst of all human life being there, you see the purposes of God. You can see where it's gone wrong because people have rebelled. You can see where it goes right because people start submitting their lives to God. And this is what makes it so exciting. It's not just any old story. It's the greatest story ever told because we get the behind the scenes actions. This isn't just what's on the stage. We get to know what's on God's heart, who's actually put all of this on the stage, as it were. And so the stories are just so rich. So this is not a boring book if you actually get round to reading it. Now, I know the way in which it's presented can look a little bit boring. I mean, what else do you read these days that comes in little neat columns in very small print with lots of little extra bits written down the middle? It just looks so difficult to read, doesn't it? But that doesn't mean it's boring. If you can't read it in its kind of format that it's set out in most people's Bibles, get a different Bible, because it's the content that we're talking about, not the presentation. It doesn't need a black cover. It doesn't really need to be set out in columns like most Bibles are. It doesn't even need the ribbons in, which you can use to keep your place. It can just be a book that you pick up and think, this book is like any other book, but actually more exciting, because story follows story follows story. And as you begin to realize that these stories actually have a common thread, you begin to see how the Bible fits together. And that makes it even less boring, because to me, one of the exciting things about the Bible is seeing how everything fits together and suddenly begins to make sense. So it's not a boring book. It's a book where you can enjoy the stories, but more than that, it's a book where you can, just spread your, your wisdom and your detective skills, and just begin to see how everything fits together as you begin to discover for yourselves the plan and purpose of God. And that is the most exciting search in all of history. And the Bible is a great place for doing that search, to find out the plan and purpose of God. So not boring. Now, what about difficult? As I've implied, some of the difficulty lies in the way that it's presented. It's not the way that we normally have a book presented. But actually, it's presented as it is because it's helpful. It's helpful to have that little line down the middle where many of you get all these quotations. This is also said in another verse, and in a different version it could say this. All of that's really helpful, because it does mean that this book has been looked at by all kinds of people. And what they've tried to do is to give us help to understand it. Now, at times I know that when people give you so much help to understand it, you begin to think, hold on, that does mean that it's really difficult. And in fact, I get the impression that some people want you to think it's a difficult book, because then they're going to sound even more important, because they can come along and say, let me explain it to you. But actually, someone said to me once, the Bible is such a simple book that you need help to misunderstand it. And I think, well, that's what a lot of people offer. They offer us help, which says, you don't need to read it like this, you need to read it like that. And before you know where you are, you've lost the plain and obvious meaning of the Bible, and you've gone down some rabbit hole that you probably would have been better to have avoided. And that is really just a way of saying to you, look, if you come to the Bible with that simple open heart, I just want to understand this. And you know, one of the great things is this, that if you do find it difficult, have a word with the one who inspired it. You know, have a conversation with God, saying, God, I know you inspired this book. I know you inspired every single person who wrote it. I know that everything in this book has got your breath in it. Now, please help me to understand it. And if you come with that kind of mind and you're praying, God, you know, I don't quite get that verse. And, you know, maybe you'll have to come back to it again at some point when you know a little bit more of the context and you realize that some of those things that once looked impossible begin to make absolute sense. So don't approach it thinking this is a difficult book. Approach it thinking this is an important book, and it's great that the author is alongside to help me understand it. And don't pay too much attention to some of the people who are working really hard to help you to misunderstand it, because it isn't really a difficult book. This is, you know, when Jesus was with his 12 and people were going away because they couldn't understand some of the sayings of Jesus because they were hard. They said to him, Jesus, when he said to them, are you going as well? They said, well, where can we go? Because you have the words of life. And this book is the word of life. And that brings me to my third misconception, that this is a dead book. Actually, it's the most alive book that there is in the whole wide world. And I can say that confidently, even though there are so many books in the world, because this book isn't just alive, it can make you alive too. Because it says in this book, Jesus said, you search the scriptures because in them you think you have life, but you don't come to me that you might have that life. And that's what we've got to do. This book is incredible because it can be the link that brings us into a living relationship with God. So any book that can bring you into a living relationship with God is obviously going to be a living book. There's something about this book that is just so high-powered that it's someone who had to write a translation. They went back into the original languages and they started writing this. It was someone called J.B. Phillips who did some translation work on the Bible. And when someone asked him what it was like translating the Bible, he said, it's a bit like rewiring a house with the power still left on. If you can imagine what that's like, if you've ever even tried to rewire a switch, you don't want to do it with the power left on. But he said, actually, when he was trying to put the Bible into manageable English for some people, he said it was like trying to rewire a house with the power switched on, because it is a living book. So there are 3 misconceptions. Now, I'm going to give you a challenge. I'm going to say, I want you to get hold of this book, and I want you to prove to yourself it's not boring, it's not difficult, and it's not dead. And I'm sure that if you go with that kind of attitude and you read it with an open heart, you're going to discover it to be the most exciting, easy to read, delightfully inspiring, life-giving book that you've ever gone to in the whole of your life.